On July 24th, China cut off the supply of dual-use goods to 14 European companies. One of them was Rheinmetall, Germany's largest arms manufacturer and the single most important supplier to Europe's rearmament. The order came from China's Ministry of Commerce in an announcement numbered 30 of 2026. It took effect the same day, and it carries no expiry date. This was retaliation, and the arithmetic was deliberate. One day earlier, the European Union had adopted its 21st sanctions package against Russia, and 14 of the entities it named were firms based in mainland China and Hong Kong. 14 listed in Brussels, 14 listed in Beijing the next morning. Never miss an episode. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay in the loop. Counted that way, it looks like a minor and largely symbolic exchange between two economies that would both rather not escalate. The European package ran to 218 designations. China answered 14 of them. But the Chinese announcement contains a clause that does not stop at China's border. That clause, rather than the count, is what makes this worth following. Dual-use items are goods with both civilian and military applications. Machine tools, optical sensors, specialty chemicals, certain electronic components. Ordinary industrial inputs that are also useful for building weapons. The EU said the 14 Chinese firms it listed had helped Russia get around export controls, particularly on microelectronics, computer-controlled machine tools, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That package was the largest in 4 years, covering 170 entities and 48 individuals across Russian energy, banks, crypto services, and military suppliers. Beijing rejects that account, and the evidence behind the listings has not been made public. The 14 European entities are spread across 8 member states. Germany accounts for 3 of them, including Rheinmetall. Rheinmetall sold 9.9 billion euros of equipment in 2025, an increase of 29% in a single year, and closed December with an order backlog of 63.8 billion euros, more than 6 years of production at the current rate. The company expects to grow another 40 to 45% this year. France also accounts for 3 of the 14, among them a drone maker and a joint semiconductor research laboratory. Italy and Poland account for 2 each, Poland's including a public university rather than a company. The remaining 4 sit in the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Lithuania. The announcement prohibits 3 things. Chinese exporters may not send dual-use items to any of the 14. Organizations and individuals outside China are barred from passing Chinese-origin dual-use items to them, and any business already underway involving those goods has to stop immediately. The second prohibition is the one that matters, because it reaches beyond China's borders. A supplier in Malaysia or Brazil that buys a Chinese-made component and resells it into one of the 14 European firms is now, in Beijing's reading, in breach of Chinese law. The restriction binds only where there is Chinese origin content. No Chinese material, no restriction. That carve-out is what keeps the measure from being a blanket ban. It is also what makes it hard to comply with. The work of enforcement falls on companies rather than on customs officials. A European manufacturer now has to establish whether any input at any tier of its supply chain began in China, and most manufacturers cannot answer that question quickly. The European Central Bank examined this problem last year. It found that more than 80% of large European firms sit within 3 intermediaries of a Chinese rare earth producer, close enough to matter and far enough down that most companies have never had to look. So the compliance problem spreads well past the 14 names. Suppliers with no listing of their own may simply pause shipments, rather than test where Chinese enforcement ends. There is a licensing channel. The Ministry of Commerce says exports may still proceed where they are genuinely required in exceptional cases, subject to application. It sets out no standard for approval, which leaves the discretion in Beijing's hands. The technique is not new, and it has already been shown to work. In April of last year, China restricted 7 rare earth elements and the magnets made from them. Chinese magnet shipments fell by roughly 75%. By June, European carmakers had run their stocks down and production lines across the continent stopped. In October, Beijing went further, requiring government approval before anyone could sell a foreign-made product containing even trace amounts of Chinese-sourced rare earth material. Announcement number 30 applies that same logic to a named list rather than to a class of materials. That brings back the arithmetic from the start. At this point, an obvious question is why China's answer was so narrow when the package it responded to ran to 218 designations. There are 2 possible explanations. The first is that the restraint is the message. Beijing matched the Chinese portion of the package exactly, showing that European sanctions now carry a cost, while keeping wider action in reserve. controls on materials rather than on named firms. The second is that China's own exposure argues for caution. Europe remains one of its largest export markets, and a heavier retaliation risks pushing the EU toward the American position on Chinese technology, which Beijing has spent years trying to avoid. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. A narrow measure can be a warning and a hedge at the same time. Europe's reaction so far has been procedural. The Commission said it was analyzing the measures, would consult the member states and companies affected, and would seek clarification from its Chinese counterparts. That is an intention to talk rather than a countermeasure, and nothing further has followed in the days since. The greatest obstacle to anything firmer is structural. Europe is rearming faster than it has in 70 years. European military spending rose 14% in 2025 to $864 billion, which the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute records as the sharpest annual increase since 1953. Germany alone spent $114 billion, up 24%. Almost none of that buildup can be made without Chinese material. The EU buys 98% of its rare earth magnets from China, and those magnets sit inside the motors and sensors of very nearly everything Europe is now ordering. This is the fundamental dilemma facing the European Union. Enforcing sanctions on Russia's war economy means listing the intermediaries that supply it, and a substantial share of those intermediaries are Chinese. Every such listing invites an answer aimed at the inputs European rearmament depends on. In effect, the EU must choose between the completeness of its Russia policy and the security of its own defense supply chains. Tightening one loosens the other. In the short term, the commercial damage is likely to be modest. 14 firms, a licensing channel that remains at least formally open, and a restriction that binds only where Chinese content is present. Over the longer term, the measure matters for what it establishes rather than for what it costs. Beijing has now shown it will answer European sanctions by reaching into European supply chains at the point where substitution is slowest and most expensive. Whether that becomes a pattern will depend on how the EU assembles its 22nd package, and on whether it is willing to accept the same exchange a second time. The listing of 14 companies is a small commercial event. What it exposes is that Europe's ability to sanction Russia and its ability to rearm now run through the same relationship, and that Beijing has found where the two meet. That's all for today. Your daily shot of the world.